Steeped in a history of controversy, the Mantis warriors fight hard to reclaim the honour they once lost. In this video we're going to show you exactly how to paint the armour of the Mantis Warrior Space Marines. And to prepare our model for painting, we've already undercoated it here with Mechanicus Standard Grey spray. Now once that spray has dried, it's time to start painting the larger areas of the armour, and that's the green bits. So for this we're using a base coat of War Flesh and our large base brush. So let's get started. Let's take some War Flesh from the pot and onto our palette here. Now here we'll take a little bit of water from our water pot just to help thin down that base coat to make it go on real smooth. There we go, perfect. Then onto the Space Marine. Here we're painting the War Flesh all over the green segments over the armour. Now we're going to be a little bit messy here. We're going to hit parts of the model that aren't going to be armour eventually. That's not a problem. You're going to go back later on and paint those anyway. But here we're looking for a nice smooth base coat of War Flesh over the entire armour. The only bits we're going to miss here, of course, are the backpack, the shoulder pads, and that faceplate as well, as they're going to be different colours later on. So there we go, that's the green segment of our armour base coated. Next up, let's shade the armour down a touch. Here we're going to be using a contrast paint, Basilicanum Grey, as it's absolutely perfect for the job. Grab your small airbrush for this one. Let's take some paint out of the pot here and apply it to our palette. Now we're not thinning this down at all, as Basilicanum Grey, being a contrast paint, comes pre-thinned. What we are doing is making sure there's not too much paint on our brush. We're on a nice pointy brush here. Perfect. Then onto our Mantis Warrior. Here we're applying this carefully into the recesses between all the armour plates. So we're going to be dragging that Basilicanum Grey round in all the recesses on the green armour, like so. You'll notice it just naturally flows into the recesses, giving this really cool shaded effect. Take your time on this one. Don't have to rush it if you don't want to. Make sure you're getting it as neat as possible and get around all the areas of the green armour. Once that's done, it's time to highlight it up. So there we go, the shades applied. Now with our armour base coated and shaded, it's time to highlight it up. And for this we'll use two highlights. First Lauren Forest and then Strachan Green, both of which we're going to be using our small airbrush to apply. Let's take some Lauren Forest from the pot and onto our palette. Now Lauren Forest is already quite a thin paint, but we still want this first highlight to be quite subtle when it goes on. So we add a touch of water, not too much, just a little bit, there we go, just to make sure it really goes on nice and thin. Get a nice fine point in your brush again, then we're ready to highlight our Space Marine. Here we're adding these highlights onto the very edges of the armour panels. So essentially work your way around the entire model like this, working these lines onto the edges of the armour panels like this. Now this is going to take some time to do, but it's really worth taking the time to be as neat as you possibly can. Don't worry if you do make a mistake, you can always go back and correct yourself with that War Flesh paint in the pot if you need to. Up next we thin down some Strachan Green, and here we're applying a really fine edge highlight along the ridges of the armour as well. Here for this highlight we're going to be using the edges of our brush quite a lot. So on the edges such as the shoulder pad trim here, the gorget and other hard edges, use the edge here to get a really nice fine highlight. There's our green armour done. Alright, up next let's have a look at painting that sort of off yellow colour the Mantis Warriors wear on their faceplates and shoulder pads. Now for this we'll start off with a base coat of Zemesi Desert. Then we'll shade down into the recesses with Skeleton Horde contrast paint. Then we're going to use a highlight of Avalon Sunset and then a highlight of Ungor Flesh over the top of that. First of all, that base coat of Zemesi Desert, and for this we're using our medium layer brush. Now let's take some paint from the pot and onto our palette. Now Zemesi Desert is a layer paint rather than a base paint, which is unusual to be base coating with, but it's the right colour to use. But it does mean we're not going to have to add too much water to get a nice thinned down version of this paint. Ready for painting. There we go, perfect. Load our brush up, then onto our Mantis Warrior. Here we're painting this onto the shoulder pads either side, and of course the faceplate at the front too. Now you may see straight away, as this is a layer paint, it may not go on as such a solid colour to start with. Not a problem at all. Let the first coat dry, then we'll add a second coat over the top of that. Next up we've got our small layer brush out, and we're adding some Skeleton Horde into the recesses of this yellow. So here we're just carefully working around the insides of the shoulder pad, and also into the small grooves in the faceplate too. Next up we're applying a highlight of Avalon Sunset. Now it's going on the ridges on the faceplate here, but also on the inside top edges of the shoulder pads here. So just get your brush nice and flat and round like so. The highlights on the inside of the shoulder pads can be quite thick, as we're going to have another highlight going on in a moment. Last on this colour, it's Ungor flesh being used as a fine highlight, so just inside that line we've already painted on the shoulder pad here, and also on the face plates too. And that's the off yellow done. The last thing to do on the Mantis Warrior's armour is that black power pack on his back. Now for this we'll start off with a base coat of Abaddon Black, then we'll highlight that with Eshin Grey and Dawnstone respectively. For the base coat of Abaddon Black, we're going back to our medium layer brush. So let's take some paint from the pot like so, and onto our palette here. Cheeky little bit of water just to help thin it down, and then onto our Mantis Warrior. Here we're just picking out the backpack here, so the entire pack we can cover it with Abaddon Black right now. Try real hard here not to hit the yellow or the green areas of the model, as you spent a long time painting those, but don't worry if you do, you can go back and correct it. Next up, with our small layer brush, we're applying a thin down highlight of Eshin Grey to the very edges of our power pack. Then a second highlight of Dawnstone is applied onto the backpack, again this time using the edge of the brush to get really thin highlights on the very edges of the power pack. Once we've done this, we're going to go around the rest of the model and paint the parts we haven't painted with Abaddon Black, ready for you to finish the miniature. And with that, our Mantis Warrior's armour is complete. And that's how you can paint your Mantis Warrior's armour as you're trying to recapture your honour. Hope you've enjoyed the video. Happy painting.